The French Revolution. This was a revolution known for its bloody reign of terror, which was carried out by extremists who violently overthrew the country and executed anyone in their way. Most of these executions were done by guillotine in a public square as a public display. This ain't just a random history lesson I put together to show off or to bore you with. It applies directly to you and I and our current political atmosphere. The new radicals of our day have studied this, and so should you. It's a favorite of theirs, and they let us know increasingly as time marches on.
Chaz has changed its name. The new name is CHOP. Yes, CHOP, as in chop off your head in a Jacobin revolution using a guillotine. I've been mocked and ridiculed for years for knowing history.
It's not Chaz, it is CHOP. Has anybody here ever heard of the French Revolution before? That is another revolution because people started putting property over lives. They started putting money over people. Does anybody here know what happened to the people who did not pay off for the French Revolution? Say it louder. Say it louder. That is the message we need to send. We are serious. This is not a joke. It is not Chaz. It is CHOP.
The French Revolution. This will be America if it continues to escalate in the fashion that it has. Examples can always be readily drawn from history, but you can truly understand what's going on now by examining an excerpt from history known as the Jacobin Reign of Terror, the most infamous part of the French Revolution. Providing background context to the revolution in France is ultimately illustrating the first of the parallels between the Jacobin Revolution and what's happening today. Much like any other time where conflict is imminent, there was an increasing tension, and that tension was mounting between the royalist reactionaries, which we will call conservatives. They defended traditional values, Christianity, and order. The other main faction, for all intents and purposes, was the revolutionaries, who will be called collectively as liberals or Jacobins. There was also a great divide, much like the US today, between the people of rural France and the people of urban centers of power. And these people legislated laws based on a premise that whatever was good for Paris was good for all of France. This parallel is most evident today whenever discussions of the Electoral College comes up. At that time, France was facing an economic crisis. They were involved in war and other conflicts, and there were revolutionary insurrectionists who sought to undermine the existing governing structures of France. Sound familiar? The revolution began in 1789, and it began with America as their role model. Thomas Jefferson, the founder of our Democratic Party, was a huge supporter of the Jacobins. He was once quoted in a letter to William Short regarding the French Revolution, saying, "Rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country and left free, it would be better than as it now is." Most historians cite King Louis XVI firing the finance minister as the flashpoint, but the truth is it's far more complex than that. And the truth is that the country was deeply divided, and this was just the straw that broke the camel's back, and that straw then caught fire and sparked a flame that went on to rage for 10 years. Paris was soon consumed by riots, chaos, and widespread looting. The mobs had the support of some of the French Guard, which is another parallel. Citizens stormed an armory known as the Bastille, and then they were adequately armed. The Bastille of today seems to be the unending amount of charitable donations from celebrities, corporations, and even certain puppet masters of the ruling class through their NGOs and foundations. The saying used to go, "The revolution will not be televised," insinuating that it was completely organic and underground. Now, today, it is, "The revolution will be televised, mainstream, and sponsored by corporations." The revolutionaries took the cities hostage, and because of this, they eventually gained control of the country. In 1792, the revolution was successful in abolishing the monarchy and founding the First Republic of France. However, this republic would not be successful. It would be riddled with bloodshed, division, and strife. In January of 1793, King Louis XVI walked up to the gallows of the guillotine and stoically began to say, "I trust that my death will be for the happiness of my people, but I grieve for France, for I fear she may suffer the anger of the Lord." His voice was then intentionally drowned out by the drum roll played by the guards in the same way the dialogue has been overrun by angry mobs today. The sentiment of judgment from God was scoffed at. He stopped speaking and lay down, where they took his head and then showed it off like a trophy to the bloodthirsty crowd. The French Queen, Marie Antoinette, is often misquoted in saying, "Let them eat cake," regarding the poor and struggling French. But the source of this is actually a post-French revolutionary piece of propaganda. Nevertheless, a common Marxist phrase arose in response to this. Rather than eating cake, the Marxists vowed to eat the rich. At the start of the revolution, between 1789 and 1792, the revolutionaries were seemingly unified in their cause. However, once they gained control and had to decide how they wanted to govern the country, the revolutionaries became divided amongst themselves. The Jacobins were made up of different factions. By this time, there were no right-wing or conservatives left or allowed in the government. They were all arrested and/or executed. Those who were considered conservative at that time were still ultimately Jacobins. They just weren't as radical. These were the moderates who still wanted a republic rather than a monarchy, but they didn't hold the belief that the end goal justified the means to get there. In other words, they valued human life. The radicals, of course, felt that the revolution was by any means necessary and that the moderates would only hurt their cause, so they silenced the more reasonable voices. Much like the extreme left identitarians have done in our country today, the more moderate people of the left are afraid of the mob. The radicals evidently loved humanity so much they were willing to purge anyone standing in their way. In 1793, the radical Jacobins began to get rid of anyone who was counter-revolutionary or not revolutionary enough, including members of their own party. Instrumental in this purge of France was Maximilien Robespierre. He headed the Committee of Public Safety, a committee that was commissioned to stabilize the French economy during the time of conflict at the beginning of the revolution. The committee was an official governmental type of bureaucracy, like the FBI, the CIA, or the IRS. Not only was Robespierre the chief speaker for the CPS, but he was also the leader of the French Republic during the Reign of Terror. Prior to the Reign of Terror, which began in 1793, the Republic saw its leadership change hands 7 times in 2 years, until Robespierre ascended to the leadership role he is now infamous for. There might have been a revolution without Robespierre, although it wouldn't have been the same revolution without him. He was the brains behind a lot of it, and looking back, his words were the voice and his actions guided the hand of the revolution and its purge. So what did he believe, and how did it turn so violent? These things don't just happen overnight, and they don't just show up wherever people disagree. Robespierre drew heavily on the Enlightenment thinkers, in particular, Rousseau's social contract. Thinkers of the Enlightenment sought to do things based on reason, not based on what they deemed as superstitious and oppressive religious dogma. They created the concept of a secular society and religious freedom. The United States was founded and based on these principles. France took it a bit further. Their proverbial axiom was liberty, equality, and fraternity, which sounds peachy and benevolent, but it was really and truly Orwellian doublespeak. Because you only had liberty if you were pro-revolution and you did what the new government allowed. Only pro-Jacobins, urban folk, and atheists were treated with quote-unquote equality. And as far as fraternity goes, they were plagued with infighting on all levels, and in every faction there was a splinter group. However, once the Jacobins killed their way to power, the Committee of Public Safety gave itself dictatorial powers to protect the revolution. This allowed them to impose their will on the people, allegedly for the people, and all of humanity. One of the very first policies they enacted was the persecution of the church. In summation, being Christian was outlawed. Priests were given the choice to die or sign an oath of allegiance to the new government, which gave that government the permission to dictate the church's everyday matters. Crosses, relics, bells, and imagery were all destroyed by iconoclasts. church property was confiscated and churches were burned to the ground. Christians who resisted were executed. It was against the law to celebrate holy days, or name your child after a Christian saint, or have a Christian burial, or give shelter to a Christian that was being hunted by the Jacobins in the name of liberty and equality. The new French regime was so anti-Christ, they abolished the 6-day work week with a day of rest and replaced it with a 9-day work week with a day of rest, and proceeded to change the calendar to where the year 0 coincided with the year that the Republic was formed. The Jacobins mandated that citizens participate in a new religion that is based on being against religion, and it was called the cult of reason, paradoxically. The Jacobins were against the God of the Bible, but they weren't opposed to a God, because the cult of reason eventually became the cult of the supreme being, which is Masonic, which in turn is Luciferian. However, by being diametrically opposed to the God of the Bible, they were also against his traditional values. And why were they against the God of the Bible? To get rid of the dogma. In other words, to do whatever they felt like doing, which is the main premise behind Luciferianism. As Aleister Crowley once said, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Now, in removing God and following that premise, you begin to play God and establish your own truths and dogmas. Just as Lucifer said in Genesis 3 when he spoke to Eve and said, "Ye shall be as gods." When you remove God, you also remove all truth, because who else other than the creator of the universe can set forth truth and order? If there is a God, there is objective truth and morality. If there is no God, there is no truth. Everything is subjective. When you remove God, you say, I decide what is wrong and what is right based on what I think, and thus truth and morality become malleable and subjective. This is why they worship reason, laughably, as it is a gift of God. Virtue, almost universally, can be defined as morally upright. In Robespierre's France, virtue was defined as whatever the popular opinion of the people was. Robespierre also defined terror as a means to implement his version of virtue. In a speech given in February of 1794 at the pinnacle of his power and during the Reign of Terror, he justified using terror to achieve peace and whatever else the people desired. Quote, "The first maxim of policy ought to be to lead the people by reason and the people's enemies by terror." End quote. I find this to be self-refuting because reason requires dialogue. But if you opposed the Jacobin narrative, you were an enemy and thus deserved terror. Like today, redefine words and say all the people agree, only Nazis don't, and Nazis don't deserve to live. He went on to say that, quote, "Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. It is therefore an emanation of virtue," end quote. Robespierre taught that the more free a people, the more virtuous and morally upright they would be. He believed he could legislate happiness without stopping to think that this would require massive and pervasive intrusion into the daily lives of everyone. In other words, you will be happy, or else. Robespierre taught that a revolution was necessary for virtue and terror or violence was the only way to make it happen. Once the Jacobins made it happen, anyone who so much as grumbled was charged with treason by Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. The source of all the terror during the reign of the Jacobins was the Committee of Public Safety, an oxymoronic name that I'm sure George Orwell drew upon when he coined the term doublespeak. Children growing up in the revolution were so used to seeing people decapitated that they played soccer with human heads that still have flesh on them. The crowd would go on about how oppressed they were under the old regime as they watched the spectacle of mass executions. They ate up the propaganda and gave no thought that they were now the oppressors of the new regime. One woman's famous last words were, "Oh, liberty, the crimes that are done in thy name," right before she lost her head. Irony has it that Robespierre actually hoped the Republic would abolish the death penalty. So he sentenced thousands upon thousands to death to make sure his hopes would come to full fruition someday. The prisons were overflowing with political prisoners. Judges couldn't sentence people fast enough, which isn't good news if you've been accused. The Jacobins had nearly the entire population on guard and on the lookout for people committing heinous crimes, such as slandering the revolution, speaking against the executions, speaking down on the new government, spreading false news, and corrupting the public conscience. Imagine how this would change people's everyday interactions with each other, being paranoid that anything you say or do could be misinterpreted, and you could end up dead for it. What about your children? What if you made someone mad? The new laws require judges to rule in one of two outcomes: complete acquittal or death. Witnesses and attorneys were not allowed for the accused. A jury would only hear the accusation, and the accuser would give a defense. There was a 75% execution rate. By the fall of 1793, when the terror began, France was overcome with mob mentality and became a classic example of mob rule. When a city or civilization has degraded to a mob mentality, for those in control, it doesn't take long to figure out that it's much easier to kill one innocent man than calm an unruly crowd. You simply can't reason with a mob. Individually, you can reason with a person. The same is not the case with an angry large crowd who's convinced they have the moral high ground to create virtue with terror. Mob rule, however, is when members of the mob are in the jury, and the government is sympathetic to their cause and dictates life according to the demands of the mob. We are beginning to see this today. A man gets flogged by an angry mob and is forced to defend himself, and the man is then arrested and charged for going against the mob. Today, there are tiny little Robespierres all over Twitter, and members of the Committee of Public Safety don a blue checkmark by their name. They engage in cancel culture. They scan and scour people's posts as far back as 2008 and demand they be fired from their jobs and blackballed from employment anywhere when they find something deemed politically incorrect by today's standard. We have seen certain victims of this have their information released only for people to show up where they live in the middle of the night. Up until this point, it has been extremely annoying, but if it keeps escalating, people will be beaten until they're maimed or worse. During the fervor of mob rule, even Robespierre's fellow statesmen were scared to sleep at their homes, because arrests usually happen in the middle of the night. In 13 months, 67 of them were executed, committed suicide, or died in prison. Robespierre had the former leader of the Republic, Danton, beheaded for condemning the policy of terror to achieve the revolution, a policy where at least 17,000 were executed by guillotine. Some experts claim up to 40,000. However, it is not clear, and keep in mind that this is only the figure for those guillotined, and it excludes the great majority of deaths by shooting, stabbing, beating, fires, starvation, people thrown from windows, and those who suffered from disease while in prison. They had conjured a spirit of terror, and everyone had gone mad. Robespierre was drunk with power. One night, he made a veiled threat that the entire governing convention needed to be purged again, but he refused to name any names. Imagine a politician standing up in front of Congress or the Senate and saying, "There are some among you who are plotting against the revolution and are a threat to the nation. I want this governing body purged of traitors." Many of Robespierre's fellow statesmen wrote letters to family and loved ones saying essentially that tomorrow, either I or Robespierre will be dead. Before Robespierre ordered purges and gave names, people tended to say, "Hey, at least it's not me, I'll go along with it." But when Robespierre made everyone a suspect, they felt they needed to act before he did. As fate would have it, the mob eventually turned on Robespierre, or others tell it, fellow statesmen plotted to stop Robespierre and his henchmen before there was no one left to guillotine. Shortly after that tirade, while drafting a coup d'etat in the name of the French people with his closest confidants, Robespierre was arrested. Sometime after his capture that night, his jaw was shot off, possibly by his own hand. It hung off of his skull and dangled, and for the man who drove France into such a tumult with his words, he could no longer utter a coherent sentence. One man present at that time said as Robespierre lay on a table bleeding and deformed, "Who would have thought? He's outlived his own mouth." Robespierre was executed within 24 hours after his arrest and went without trial, mainly due to the fact that he was labeled an outlaw, and that was the standard treatment outlaws received. Also, he was executed promptly, partly because the chaos that ensued because of his arrest. It caused division among the troops and the people. The next day, when the executioner went to clear Robespierre's neck for the guillotine, he removed the bandage that was holding his shattered jaw in place. Robespierre screamed in agony until his head was separated from his body. That day, he was beheaded with 21 of his closest associates, but Robespierre's justification of pursuing virtue through terror outlived him and lives on today. The live and let live liberty, along with the all are created equal under the law principalities of America's founding documents, were not enough. The French government sought to force the people to be free and equal. After the definitions of liberty and equality were changed and became subjective, of course. The French Revolution in essence changed the world. It gave us communism with the redistribution of land and wealth, which is where Marx drew his inspiration from. They sought to make everyone equal. Instead, they made everyone but the ruling class equally poor, just like every other crude communist takeover. It also gave us the hypocrisy of postmodern liberty and equality, where you are equal and at liberty to do anything or be anyone unless you're a Christian or question their subjective definitions. The French Revolution left the world a reproachable legacy in the long run, but what it gave the French at that time was far worse. The birth rate decreased and the death rate increased. Foundations that had funded schools, hospitals, and gave aid to the poor were closed and never reinstated. The annual government deficit increased from 10% of the gross national product right before the revolution to 64% by the Reign of Terror. After land redistribution and a bad harvest in 1794, inflation had reached a level of 3,500%. In other words, the Jacobin ruling class messed up the economy so bad in 5 or 6 years that $3,500 was only worth $1 in purchasing power. That currency was withdrawn the next year, but the replacement also caused more inflation. Reform and inheritance, land ownership, and taxation only create a new class of ruling class landowners that replace the old nobility or aristocracy. They executed a king, and chaos ensued for 10 years until a new king emerged, one by the name Napoleon Bonaparte, who took over via a coup d'etat and declared himself an emperor and ruled by decree, much worse than any King Louis. Napoleon went on to conquer lands across much of the known world, aspiring to outdo Alexander the Great. His military feats are still studied in war colleges to this day, and the secret to his success was simple. If you throw enough bodies at them, you'll eventually win. Under Napoleon, French bodies were cheap and in high demand. Wherever order falls, roving bands with warlords rise, because without order, there is no peace. And there are only two ways to achieve order, by force or by consensus. Order and the democratic process only work as long as the vast majority of people comply with the process. If not, then the democratic process is meaningless, order subsides, and the public is subject to violent overthrows and chaos. Chaos, where at the end of the day, might equals right, and only the strong survive. This results in factions of warlords and tyrants who rule by blood and boot because that's what it takes if the people can't agree to unify. The lines between respect, fear, and obedience begin to blur together. People who think a system is oppressive overthrow it, and then they become the oppressors until someone does the same to them. It's not progress, it's a cycle. That's why it's called a revolution. People think it can't happen here, especially in America. We have a normalcy bias, but look around, sweetie. You see it. It happened in France, in Bolshevik Russia, and continued with Stalin. It happened in Weimar Germany and all across Europe. It happened in China. It happened in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Cuba. It happened in the Balkans and in the Slavic states. It happened in Africa, Central America, and to some extent, in Venezuela. They all wanted a utopia, a heaven on earth. They all purged their societies, and every time a dictator ascended to power, it can happen here. It will happen here if calm voices don't prevail over the mob. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a nation divided and at war with itself could fight it out. But today, though, when a country falls in a chaotic civil war, a foreign power comes to occupy the country and intervene to restore power or spread democracy. And if it seems that things are coming full circle for America, maybe it is. Whether it's right or wrong matters not. Fate is determined by decisions. That's the logos of history.